The auction block stood weathered and worn in the center of Millbrook's town square, its surface stained dark from decades of desperate transactions. On this particular morning in March 1882, it would witness a sale that would change two lives forever. Though neither the buyer nor the merchandise understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold, Thomas Fletcher stood at the back of the gathered crowd, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the cobblestones. At 34, the blacksmith had become as much a fixture of this Pennsylvania town as his forge itself, known for his skilled metalwork and his peculiar silence. Children whispered that he'd forgotten how to speak after years of communicating only with hammer and anvil. Though the truth was far more complicated. Before him on the platform stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, her dark hair hanging like a curtain around a face that bore the marks of recent hardship. What struck Thomas most wasn't her obvious fear or the way she kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet. It was her absolute silence, not the silence of someone choosing not to speak, but the profound quiet of someone who had never learned how. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. What am I bid for this one? Young, healthy, good for household work or whatever other purposes a man might require. Starting at $50. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as he watched the girl's shoulders tense at those words. He'd seen enough cruelty in his 34 years to recognize it immediately, and the hungry looks on some of the bidders' faces told him exactly what other purposes they had in mind. Without fully understanding why, Thomas raised his hand. $50 to the blacksmith. The auctioneer called out, his surprise evident. Thomas Fletcher rarely attended auctions and never participated. Do I hear 60? A portly man in expensive clothes near the front raised his hand, leering at the girl with undisguised intent. 60. Thomas's jaw clenched. 100, he called out, his voice rusty from disuse but carrying clearly across the square. Crowd turned to stare at him in shock. $100 was more than most men in Millbrook made in 3 months. The portly man's face reddened, but he didn't counter the bid. $100. The auctioneer repeated, scanning the crowd. For any other offers, going once. Going twice. Sold to Thomas Fletcher. As the gavel fell, Thomas caught the girl's eyes for just a moment. They were the color of storm clouds, wide with confusion and a spark of something that might have been hope. She looked at him as if trying to solve a puzzle, perhaps wondering why a stranger would pay such an enormous sum for someone the world had deemed worthless. Thomas pushed through the crowd toward the platform, fishing worn bills from his leather pouch. As he counted out the money, he became acutely aware of the whispered conversation starting around him. What's old Tom Fletcher want with a mute girl? Probably tired of talking to his horses all day. Heard she's been through 3 families already. Can't do nothing but basic work. The auctioneer completed the paperwork with practiced efficiency, though his eyes held curiosity about the unusual transaction. She comes with the clothes on her back and a work contract, he explained. To Thomas, name's recorded as Elena Hartwell, though I doubt she can tell you much about herself. Thomas nodded, pocketing the papers without reading them. He approached the girl slowly, the way he might approach a spooked horse. When he was close enough to speak without the whole town hearing, he said quietly, "My name is Thomas. I have a home where you'll be safe." Elena studied his face with those intelligent gray eyes, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once and stepped down from the platform to follow him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The walk from Millbrook's town square to Thomas's property took nearly 20 minutes, winding through tree-lined streets where curious neighbors peered from behind curtains at the unusual pair. Thomas kept his pace deliberately slow, noting how Elena favored her left foot slightly, and how she instinctively kept herself positioned where she could see his hands at all times. The girl had learned to read danger in small details. He realized the way someone held their shoulders, the tension in their jaw, the speed of their movements. It was the kind of awareness that came from years of needing to anticipate violence before it arrived. Thomas's property sat on the outskirts of town, where the residential streets gave way to farmland and forest. The main house was modest but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun and flower boxes that spoke to careful tending. Behind it stood the forge, its chimney rising like a sentinel against the sky. "This is home, Thomas," said simply as they approached the front steps. Elena stopped walking and stared at the house with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. She looked from the painted shutters to the neat garden beds, then back to Thomas himself, as if trying to understand some sort of trick being played on her. Slowly, she raised her hands and began making gestures that Thomas recognized as sign language, though he couldn't interpret the specific meaning. Her movements were fluid and precise, clearly the product of years of practice. But when Thomas shook his head apologetically, Elena's face fell. "I don't understand," Thomas said gently. "But maybe ... maybe we can figure out other ways to talk." Elena tilted her head, considering this. After a moment, she pointed to herself, then made a gesture that might have been her name. Then she pointed to Thomas and raised her eyebrows questioningly. "Thomas," he said, pointing to himself. Then he pointed to her and raised his own eyebrows. Elena's face brightened slightly. She pointed to herself and carefully mouthed what looked like Elena, though no sound emerged. It was the first time Thomas had seen anything resembling a smile cross her features. The front door opened to reveal a hallway, with polished wooden floors and walls lined with Thomas's metalwork, decorative pieces that showed an artist's eye alongside the purely functional items that paid his bills. Elena stopped just inside the threshold, turning slowly to take in the unexpected beauty of the space. She approached one of the wall pieces slowly, a delicate iron rose that seemed to bloom from the wall itself. Her fingers hovered just above the metal petals, not quite touching but clearly fascinated by the craftsmanship. Thomas watched her examination with growing interest. Most people saw his decorative work as a curiosity at best, impractical frivolity at worst. But Elena studied the piece with the intensity of someone who understood the difficulty of creating beauty from raw materials. "Do you like it?" Thomas asked. Elena turned to him and nodded emphatically, then pointed from the rose to Thomas with an expression of amazement. She gestured toward the forge visible through the back window, then back to the delicate metalwork, clearly impressed by the contrast between the brutal work environment and the refined artistry it produced. Thomas felt an unexpected warmth at her appreciation. "I'll show you the forge later, if you'd like. Most of my work is more practical, horseshoes, tools, repairs. But sometimes..." He trailed off, not sure how to explain the compulsion that drove him to spend hours crafting objects that served no purpose beyond beauty. Elena waited patiently for him to continue, but when he remained silent, she simply nodded as if she understood anyway. The kitchen was Thomas's pride, equipped with a modern cast-iron stove and a hand pump that brought water directly to the sink. Elena's eyes widened at the luxury of indoor plumbing, clearly not something she'd encountered in her previous situations. Thomas opened cabinets to show her where supplies were kept, then gestured toward the stove. "Are you hungry?" "I was about to make breakfast." Elena nodded, but when Thomas began pulling out ingredients, she quickly moved to intercept him. She pointed to herself, then to the food, with an expression that clearly said she should be doing the cooking. "You don't have to," Thomas said. "I've been taking care of myself for years." But Elena was already examining the available ingredients with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to making meals from whatever was available. She found eggs, bacon, flour, and milk, then looked around until she located a mixing bowl and skillet. Thomas retreated to the kitchen table to watch as Elena moved through his kitchen with growing confidence. Her movements were economical and precise, suggesting years of experience cooking under challenging conditions. She cracked eggs with one hand while testing the skillet's temperature with the other, her attention divided between multiple tasks with the skill of someone who'd learned efficiency through necessity. What struck Thomas most was how she moved. Quietly, almost soundlessly, as if she'd trained herself to work without drawing attention. Every cabinet door closed softly, every utensil placed down with careful precision. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned that making noise could bring unwanted attention. As Elena worked, Thomas found himself studying her more closely. Despite her obvious wariness, there was something graceful about her movements, an intelligence in how she adapted to the unfamiliar kitchen layout. Her dress was patched and faded, but clean and carefully mended, suggesting pride despite limited resources. When she turned to check something on the stove, Thomas noticed a thin scar running along her left temple, mostly hidden by her hair. Other, smaller marks on her hands and arms spoke to a hard life, though whether from work, accident, or deliberate harm, he couldn't tell. Elena served breakfast with the same quiet efficiency she'd used in preparation, setting Thomas's plate before him with a small, hesitant smile. The food was excellent, better than anything Thomas had managed in his years of bachelor cooking. The eggs were perfectly set, the bacon crispy but not burned, and she'd somehow managed to create fluffy biscuits from his basic supplies. "This is wonderful," Thomas said, taking his first bite. "Thank you." Elena's smile became more genuine, and she ducked her head in what might have been embarrassment at the praise. She ate her own portion slowly, as if savoring both the food and the novelty of eating at a proper table, rather than standing or taking meals wherever she could find space. Halfway through breakfast, Elena suddenly stopped eating and looked at Thomas with an expression of growing anxiety. She pointed to herself, then around the kitchen, then made gestures that seemed to be asking about work or duties. Thomas realized she was trying to understand what would be expected of her, what tasks she'd need to perform to justify her presence. The question in her eyes was painfully clear. What would he require in exchange for food and shelter? "You don't owe me anything," Thomas said carefully. "This isn't. You're not here to work off a debt or earn your keep. You're here because everyone deserves a safe place to live." Elena stared at him for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this concept. She pointed to herself again, then made what looked like cleaning motions, then cooking gestures, her eyebrows raised questioningly. Thomas could see that the idea of receiving care without owing labor in return was foreign to her entire experience. "If you want to help around the house, that's fine. But it's not required. This is your home now, not a job." The word home seemed to hit Elena like a physical blow. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away, as if crying might somehow jeopardize this unexpected kindness. She looked around the kitchen again, but this time her gaze held wonder rather than wariness. After breakfast, Thomas showed Elena through the rest of the house. The spare bedroom that would be hers was small but bright, with a window overlooking the garden and a bed with clean linens. Elena stood in the doorway for several minutes, just staring at the space as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. She approached the bed cautiously and ran her hand over the quilt, testing its softness. Then she looked at Thomas with an expression that seemed to ask for permission. "It's yours," Thomas said gently. "For as long as you want to stay." Elena sat on the edge of the bed and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook silently, and Thomas realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finding safety after years of uncertainty. Thomas quietly left her alone, understanding that she needed time to process this dramatic change in circumstances. He busied himself with morning chores, feeding his horses and checking the forge. But his thoughts kept returning to the girl who'd somehow landed in his care. When Elena emerged from the bedroom an hour later, Her eyes were red but determined. She found Thomas in the forge, where he was banking the fire for the day's work. She watched from the doorway as he arranged his tools, clearly fascinated by the organized chaos of the workspace. Thomas noticed her interest and gestured for her to come closer. "This is where I spend most of my time," he explained, showing her the bellows, the anvil, the racks of hammers in different sizes. "It's loud and hot and dirty, but ... He picked up a piece of iron he'd been working on the previous day, the beginning of what would become a decorative gate for one of the town's wealthy families. Even in its rough state, the metalwork showed the flowing lines and careful proportions that would make it beautiful as well as functional. Elena examined the piece closely, running her fingers along the smooth curves where Thomas had shaped the iron. She looked from the metal to the forge, then to Thomas's hands, clearly trying to understand how such delicate beauty could emerge from such a brutal process. Thomas lit the forge and selected a small piece of iron from his stock. "Would you like to see how it works?" Elena nodded eagerly, stepping closer, but remaining well clear of the fire. Thomas heated the metal until it glowed orange, then carried it to the anvil where he began shaping it with careful hammer blows. The rhythm of the work was hypnotic: heat, hammer, reheat, hammer again. Elena watched intently as the shapeless piece of iron gradually became something recognizable, a small flower with delicate petals and a graceful stem. When Thomas quenched the finished piece in water, sending up a dramatic hiss of steam, Elena clapped her hands together silently, her face bright with amazement. Thomas found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. It had been years since anyone had shown such genuine appreciation for his craft. Elena pointed to the flower, then to herself with a questioning expression. "It's yours," Thomas said, holding out the still warm metal bloom. Elena accepted the gift with reverence, cradling it in her palms as if it were made of the most precious materials rather than common iron. She held it up to catch the light from the forge, admiring how Thomas had managed to capture the delicate beauty of a living flower in such an unforgiving medium. She looked at Thomas with an expression of pure gratitude, then carefully tucked the iron flower into her dress pocket, close to her heart. It was clear that this simple gift meant more to her than all the expensive jewelry in the world. As the morning progressed, Elena found ways to make herself useful around the property without being asked. She discovered Thomas's vegetable garden and began weeding with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood plants and growing things. She fed the chickens and collected eggs, cleaned the kitchen from their breakfast, and swept the front porch, but these weren't the desperate, fearful efforts of someone trying to prove their worth. Instead, Elena moved through these tasks with the quiet satisfaction of someone caring for a space that had begun to feel like home. Thomas watched her work from the forge, noting how she hummed silently to herself as she went about her chores, not making sound, but clearly experiencing music in her head that gave rhythm to her movements. There was peace in her face that hadn't been there during the morning's auction, as if the simple act of having a place to belong had begun healing wounds he couldn't even see. When the midday heat made forge work uncomfortable, Thomas found Elena in the garden, carefully tending to a row of tomato plants that had been struggling under his haphazard care. She looked up as he approached, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "You have a gift with growing things," Thomas observed, noting how the plants seemed to have perked up under her attention. Elena smiled and gestured toward the garden, then made motions that seemed to indicate she'd had experience with farming or gardening before. She pointed to several plants that Thomas had given up on, then made nurturing gestures that suggested she thought they could be saved. "Please," Thomas said, gesturing broadly at the entire garden. "Do whatever you think best. I'm better with iron than with living things." Elena's smile widened, and she nodded enthusiastically. She began pointing to different areas of the garden, clearly already making plans for improvements and expansion. Her excitement was infectious, And Thomas found himself imagining what the space might look like under her careful tending dot as they stood together in the warm sunshine. Surrounded by the peaceful sounds of birds and rustling leaves, Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. For years he'd lived in comfortable solitude, content with his work and his quiet routines, but watching Elena discover joy in simple things, a flower made of iron, dirt beneath her fingernails, the promise of plants growing strong under her care, Thomas began to understand that his life had been missing something essential. Not conversation or noise, but the quiet companionship of someone who understood the value of silence and the beauty that could be created when two people work together toward common goals. Elena looked up at him then, her gray eyes warm with something that might have been gratitude or contentment or the beginning of trust. In that moment, Thomas realized that saving Elena from the auction block had somehow saved something in himself as well. Something he hadn't even known was lost until he found it reflected in the grateful gaze of a girl who spoke without words and heard without sound. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities neither had imagined. When the day began with the fall of an auctioneer's gavel and the strange transaction that had brought them together, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first week passed like a careful dance between two people learning each other's rhythms. Thomas discovered that Elena woke before dawn, moving through the house like a ghost as she prepared breakfast and tended to morning chores. She had a way of anticipating needs, his coffee ready when he emerged from his bedroom, his work clothes laid out clean and mended, lunch packed for days when he worked late at the forge. But it was the small discoveries that fascinated Thomas most. Elena's ability to communicate without words proved far more sophisticated than he'd initially realized. She developed an intricate system of gestures, expressions, and written notes that conveyed complex thoughts and emotions. On Wednesday morning, he found a piece of paper on his workbench with a detailed sketch of an improved bellows design, complete with measurements and mechanical notes written in careful script. Thomas stared at the drawing in amazement. The modifications Elena suggested would indeed improve airflow efficiency, something he'd been struggling with for months. He found her in the garden and held up the paper, his eyebrows raised in question. Elena blushed and pointed to herself, then made gestures, indicating she'd watched him work. She mimed the motion of the bellows, then showed with her hands how the air could flow more smoothly with the changes she'd drawn. "You understand mechanics," Thomas said, not quite a question. Elena nodded, then held up her hands to show him calluses that spoke of experience with tools and machinery. She made motions that suggested she'd worked in some kind of workshop or factory before, though the shadow that crossed her face told Thomas those memories weren't entirely pleasant. That afternoon, Thomas invited Elena to assist him with a complex commission, ornamental railings for the new bank building. He started to explain what he needed, then realized she was already studying the design sketches with an engineer's eye, noting stress points and suggesting improvements through quick gestures and rough drawings in the dirt floor. Working together proved revelatory. Elena's understanding of metalwork was intuitive but sophisticated. She could read the color of heated iron as well as Thomas could, knowing exactly when the metal reached the perfect temperature for shaping. Her hands were steady and sure as she held pieces for him to weld, and she anticipated his needs with uncanny accuracy. More importantly, she began to relax in the forge environment. The intense heat and deafening noise that drove most visitors away seemed to comfort Elena. Thomas realized that the forge's sensory assault provided a kind of sanctuary for someone who lived in constant awareness of her surroundings. Here, the overwhelming stimulation created a pocket of safety where threats couldn't approach unnoticed. During their lunch break, eaten in the shade behind the forge, Elena pulled out a small leather journal and began writing. Her handwriting was precise and elegant, clearly the product of good early education. She showed Thomas what she'd written. My father was a clockmaker in Pittsburgh. He taught me to see how mechanical things fit together, how each piece serves the whole. I helped in his shop from the time I could hold tools steady. We lost everything when the factory owners decided they could make cheaper timepieces with machines instead of craftsmen. Thomas read the note twice, understanding beginning to dawn. That's how you knew about the bellows design. Elena nodded, then wrote more. Father said I had better hands for delicate work than most apprentices. But when he died, no one would train a girl, especially not one who couldn't speak their language of bargaining and socializing. The story explained so much. Elena's immediate appreciation for Thomas's artistic ironwork, her understanding of his creative process, her ability to read metal and fire. She wasn't just someone seeking shelter. She was a craftsperson whose talents had been dismissed because of her gender and disability. Would you like to learn forging? Thomas asked. Not just helping, but actual metalwork? Elena's face lit up with an expression of pure joy. She wrote quickly, more than anything. But is it proper for a woman? Thomas considered this. In the cities, such arrangements would certainly raise eyebrows. But here on the outskirts of Millbrook, with his reputation for eccentricity already well established, who would question his choice of apprentice? What's proper, Thomas said slowly, is not wasting talent because society has narrow ideas about who can hold a hammer. That afternoon began Elena's real education in blacksmithing. Thomas started with basic techniques, how to hold tools properly, how to strike cleanly, how to move heated metal efficiently. Elena absorbed instruction like desert sand soaking up rain, practicing movements over and over until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Her progress was remarkable. Within days, she was creating simple items, nails, hooks, basic hardware, with a precision that would have taken most apprentices weeks to achieve. More impressively, she began suggesting variations and improvements, her clockmaker's training, evident in her attention to detail and mechanical understanding. But it was during Elena's second week that Thomas began to understand the true circumstances that had brought her to the auction block. He'd noticed Elena's tendency to avoid the main roads when walking to town for supplies, choosing instead to circle through the woods and approach from unexpected directions. She watched windows and doorways with constant vigilance, and any sudden noise or movement could freeze her in place for several seconds before she remembered she was safe. The truth emerged on a Thursday evening when Thomas returned from a late delivery to find Elena huddled in the corner of the kitchen, trembling and staring at the front door with wild eyes. A man's coat lay abandoned on the porch steps, Thomas's own coat, which had blown from the line in the afternoon wind. Elena, Thomas said softly, hanging his hat by the door and moving slowly so as not to startle her further. What's wrong? Elena pointed at the coat, then made frantic gestures that Thomas interpreted as someone approaching the house. Her terror was so genuine that Thomas checked the property thoroughly before returning to convince her they were alone. Only then did Elena's story fully emerge, written in shaking handwriting across several pages of her journal. The Bradfords. In Pittsburgh bought me after father died. Mrs. Bradford said I would be perfect for a house servant, quiet, obedient, unable to gossip about family business. But Mr. Bradford, he saw opportunities in my silence. Who would believe accusations from someone who couldn't speak? Thomas felt rage building in his chest as he read, but he kept his expression carefully neutral, understanding that Elena needed to tell this story without feeling judged or pitied. When Mrs. Bradford discovered what was happening, she blamed me for tempting her husband. She sold me to a family in Philadelphia who wanted help with their textile business. But the same patterns repeated. Men who saw my silence as invitation, women who saw me as a threat to be removed. Elena paused in her writing, looking up at Thomas with eyes that held years of accumulated fear. She seemed to be gauging his reaction, watching for signs of disgust or dismissal. "I'm sorry," Thomas said simply. "No one should have to endure that." Elena blinked in surprise, as if she'd expected a different response. She wrote, "You're not angry? Most people assume I must have encouraged such behavior somehow." "Most people," Thomas replied with quiet intensity, "are fools who blame. Victims because it's easier than confronting evil." Elena's shoulders sagged with relief. She wrote, "The Philadelphia family eventually sold me to a boarding house owner who used girls like livestock. When the authorities shut her down, we were all sent to different auctions. I thought I would end up somewhere worse each time." Thomas set the journal aside and looked directly into Elena's eyes. "That chapter of your life is finished. Here, your silence is respected, not exploited. Your skills are valued, not ignored. And your safety is protected, not negotiated." Elena covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the simple concept of unconditional security. When she looked up again, her expression held something Thomas hadn't seen before, not just gratitude or relief, but the beginning of hope. The revelation of Elena's past changed the dynamic of their relationship in subtle but significant ways. Thomas became more conscious of his movements and positioning, ensuring Elena always had clear escape routes and never felt cornered. He began announcing his presence when entering rooms, and he was careful to keep his hands visible during conversations. Elena, meanwhile, began to open up about her knowledge and interests beyond metalwork. She showed Thomas detailed botanical drawings she'd made of his garden, complete with notes about soil conditions and companion planting. Her observations about plant health and growth patterns demonstrated the same systematic thinking she applied to mechanical problems. "You see patterns everywhere," Thomas observed one evening as they reviewed her garden plans together. Elena wrote, "Father said pattern recognition was the key to good craftsmanship. Whether it's metal, plants, or machines, everything follows rules that can be learned and predicted." This systematic approach extended to her understanding of people as well. Elena had become expert at reading subtle cues, the tension in someone's shoulders that preceded anger, the particular set of a mouth that indicated deception, the way eyes moved when someone was planning something unpleasant. "You've learned to predict danger," Thomas said, understanding another piece of Elena's defensive strategies. "It kept me alive," Elena wrote, "but now I'm learning to recognize safety instead. The way you move when you're thinking about a project, how your expression changes when you're pleased with a result. It's different from watching for threats." Thomas felt something stir in his chest at this admission, pride that Elena was beginning to feel secure enough to study contentment rather than just survival, and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to examine. Their evening routines began to evolve beyond simple coexistence. Elena would bring her journal to the front porch after dinner, writing observations about the day while Thomas carved wood or worked on small repair projects. They existed in comfortable parallel silence, each occupied with solitary tasks, but sharing the peaceful companionship of mutual presence. Sometimes, Elena would show Thomas what she'd written, descriptions of cloud formations, sketches of birds, mechanical diagrams for forge improvements. Other times she kept her thoughts private, and Thomas respected that boundary without question. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Thomas realized Elena was humming, not audibly, but with a rhythm he could sense in her movements as she wrote. When he listened carefully, he could almost hear the melody in the cadence of her breathing and the tempo of her pen strokes. "You have music in your head," Thomas said suddenly. Elena looked up, startled, then nodded with a small smile. She wrote, "Always. Father said I inherited it from my mother, who was a pianist before she married. I can't hear external music, but I feel rhythms in everything, hammering, walking, even writing." "Could you teach me?" Thomas asked. "To feel the rhythms you sense?" Elena's face brightened with excitement. She stood and guided Thomas to the porch railing, placing his hands flat against the wood. Then she began tapping a complex pattern with her fingers, creating vibrations that Thomas could feel through the surface. The rhythm was intricate and beautiful, like a conversation between multiple voices. Elena's face was animated as she played, her whole body moving with the internal music that guided her movements. Watching her, Thomas understood that this was Elena's true language, not the sign language she tried to use, not the written words in her journal, but this pure expression of rhythm and pattern that transcended the need for sound. When the music ended, Elena looked at Thomas expectantly. Tentatively, he tried to reproduce the pattern he'd felt, his calloused fingers clumsy on the wood. Elena guided his hands, adjusting timing and pressure until he began to approximate the rhythm she'd shown him. For the first time since her arrival, Elena laughed, not audibly, but with her whole body, her shoulders shaking with silent mirth. At Thomas's earnest attempts to master her musical language, the sound she couldn't make filled the air anyway, in the joy that radiated from her expression and the infectious nature of her amusement. Thomas found himself laughing too, struck by the absurdity and wonder of this moment. A silent blacksmith and a mute girl creating music through touch and vibration, sharing a language that belonged entirely to them. As the evening deepened and fireflies began their dance in the garden, Thomas realized that something profound was happening between them. What had begun as a rescue was becoming a partnership, and what had started as charity was evolving into something that felt remarkably like the early stages of love. Though neither was ready to name it yet, Elena seemed to sense the shift as well. As they prepared to go inside, she wrote one final note: "Thank you for seeing me as more than just someone who needs saving." Thomas read the words by lamplight, understanding that Elena was acknowledging the transformation taking place in both their lives. She was no longer just a victim seeking shelter, and he was no longer just a protector offering sanctuary. They were becoming collaborators, partners in the creation of something entirely new. "Thank you," Thomas replied, "for showing me that silence can be full of music." The turning point came 3 weeks after Elena's arrival, when Thomas received his most challenging commission yet. Mayor Cornelius Walsh appeared at the forge on a sweltering Monday morning, his expensive suit already wilting in the heat as he surveyed Thomas's workspace with barely concealed skepticism. "Fletcher," the mayor began without preamble, "the town council has decided to commission a memorial for our war dead. Something substantial. We want the finest metalwork this county has ever seen." Thomas wiped his hands on his leather apron, studying the pompous official. Mayor Walsh had never shown interest in his artistic work before, preferring to award prestigious commissions to craftsmen from Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, who charged twice as much and delivered half the quality. "What's the timeline?" Thomas asked. 6 weeks. The memorial will be unveiled at the 4th of July celebration." Walsh pulled out a rolled paper. "These are the specifications. 15 feet tall, bronze and iron, with plaques honoring every Millbrook man who died in the war. The design must be patriotic, heroic, nothing too artistic or fancy." Thomas unrolled the plans, and his heart sank. The proposed memorial was a conventional monument, an eagle perched atop a column, surrounded by flags and military symbols. Technically demanding but artistically lifeless, the kind of work that would showcase skill without inspiring a single soul. Elena had been working quietly at her own forge station, but Thomas noticed her attention shift to their conversation. She approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the memorial plans with an expression of growing dismay. "The budget is $300, Walsh continued. "That's twice what you've ever earned on a single project, Fletcher. Of course, if you don't think you're capable of work this sophisticated." The challenge in Walsh's voice was unmistakable. Thomas was being tested, his worthiness as Millbrook's premier craftsman questioned in front of Elena. The implications stung, but not as much as the thought of spending 6 weeks creating something that would reduce the sacrifice of good men. To mere civic decoration, I'll do it, Thomas said finally. But I want creative control over the final design. Your specifications provide the basic requirements, but the artistic execution is mine to determine. Walsh's face reddened. Now see here, Fletcher. The town council expects the finest metalwork this county has ever seen, Thomas interrupted, quoting Walsh's own words back to him. That requires trusting the craftsmen they've chosen. Elena stepped forward then, placing her hand gently on Thomas's arm. She looked from the memorial plans to Thomas, then made subtle gestures that only he had learned to interpret. Her message was clear. She wanted to help with the project. Walsh noticed Elena for the first time, his gaze lingering disapprovingly on her work-stained clothes and the small hammer she still held. "And who is this?" "My apprentice," Thomas said, firmly, surprised by his own protective instincts. Elena Hartwell, an apprentice? Walsh's skepticism was obvious. A girl? Fletcher, this is serious work. The memorial represents the dignity and honor of our fallen heroes. It's not a place for experimentation. Elena's face flushed at the dismissal, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Thomas felt anger building in his chest, not just at Walsh's prejudice, but at the casual way the mayor dismissed Elena's obvious capabilities. "My apprentice's skills are exceptional," Thomas said coldly. "She'll be contributing significantly to the project." Walsh looked as if he wanted to argue further, but the lure of having the memorial completed at half the cost of hiring outside craftsmen ultimately won out. "Fine, but Fletcher, if this project fails or embarrasses the town, you'll never receive another municipal commission. Is that understood?" After Walsh left, Thomas turned to find Elena staring at the memorial plans with intense concentration. She'd spread them across the workbench and was making quick sketches in the margins, her brow furrowed with creative effort. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. Elena wrote rapidly. "The design is technically correct but emotionally empty. A memorial should help people feel the loss, not just acknowledge it. These men had names, family, stories. They deserve better than a generic eagle and flags." Thomas studied Elena's preliminary sketches, amazed by the depth of her artistic vision. Where the original plans showed rigid military symbols, Elena had sketched flowing forms that suggested movement and life. Her eagle wasn't a static perch atop a column, but a bird in flight, wings spread in protection over smaller figures below. "Show me more," Thomas said. Elena's pencil flew across the paper as ideas poured out of her. Instead of a simple column, she envisioned a spiral of iron that rose like smoke from a battlefield, carrying the souls of the fallen upward. The plaques bearing names wouldn't be flat rectangles, but curved surfaces that invited touch, encouraging visitors to trace the letters with their fingers. Most striking was Elena's central figure, not a generic soldier, but a young man removing his hat in a gesture of farewell, his face turned toward home. The figure would be life-sized, positioned so that visitors could stand beside him, sharing his final moment of humanity before battle claimed him. "It's beautiful," Thomas murmured, studying the revised design. "But can we create something this complex in 6 weeks?" Elena wrote, "Not alone, but together. We could make something that honors these men properly." The partnership that emerged over the following days transformed both their understanding of collaborative work. Elena's artistic vision combined with Thomas's technical mastery created a creative synergy neither had experienced before. She would sketch ideas in flowing lines while he calculated structural requirements and material needs. Their communication evolved beyond words or gestures into a kind of creative telepathy. Elena would begin shaping a piece of metal, and Thomas would intuitively understand her intent, adding complementary elements without discussion. Their movements in the forge became choreographed, each anticipating the other's needs and timing. Work itself proved more challenging than either had anticipated. The spiral column required precise calculations to ensure stability while maintaining the illusion of weightless ascent. The flying eagle demanded techniques neither had attempted before, combining forged iron feathers with cast bronze details in a seamless integration of materials and methods. Elena's mechanical background proved invaluable for solving structural problems, while her artistic sensibility guided aesthetic decisions. She developed innovative techniques for creating texture in metal, using tools she'd improvised from her clockmaking experience to achieve effects Thomas had never imagined possible. The most challenging element was the central figure. Creating a life-sized human form in metal required not just technical skill, but deep understanding of anatomy and emotion. Elena insisted on using her journal notes about the fallen soldiers, descriptions she'd gathered from their families and friends to ensure the figure captured something authentic about the men it represented. "He should look like someone's son," Elena wrote during one of their planning sessions. "Someone's husband or brother. Not a hero from mythology, but a real person who made a real sacrifice." They worked from dawn until well past dark, pausing only for quick meals and necessary rest. The forge became their entire world, filled with the constant sound of hammering, the hiss of quenching metal, and the wordless communication that had developed between them. 3 weeks into the project, Thomas realized that something profound had shifted in their relationship. Elena was no longer his apprentice or even his partner. She had become his equal, contributing ideas and execution with a skill that matched his own. More than that, her presence had awakened creative possibilities he'd never explored alone. "You're not just helping with this memorial," Thomas said one evening as they reviewed the day's progress. "You're making it better than I ever could have alone." Elena blushed at the praise, then wrote, "You gave me the chance to prove what I could do. Most people would have seen only my limitations." "Most people," Thomas replied, "don't understand that limitations often create the strongest foundations for excellence." It was during the 4th week that their creative partnership began evolving into something deeper. Elena had been working on the delicate feather details of the eagle's wings, her concentration so intense that she seemed unaware of anything beyond the metal taking shape under her tools. Thomas found himself watching her work with growing admiration that had little to do with her technical skills. The way afternoon light caught in her dark hair, the graceful precision of her movements, the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth when a particularly difficult technique succeeded, all of these details had begun occupying his thoughts even when they weren't working together. Elena seemed to sense his attention. She looked up from her work, meeting his gaze with those intelligent gray eyes that had first caught his attention at the auction. For a moment, neither moved, the air between them charged with unspoken recognition of feelings that had been building. For weeks, Thomas felt heat that had nothing to do with the forge as Elena continued to look at him, her expression soft and questioning. He took a step closer, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. Elena didn't retreat. Instead, she set down her tools and moved to meet him halfway across the workspace. When they were close enough to touch, she reached up slowly and placed her palm against his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with butterfly gentleness. Thomas covered her hand with his own, marveling at the contrast between her calloused palms, evidence of hard work and survival, and the tenderness of her touch. Elena's eyes searched his face, looking for confirmation of what she saw there. "Elena," Thomas said softly, her name, carrying all the emotion he couldn't yet put into words. She smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. Rising on her toes, she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was both tentative and sure. A question and an answer all at once. The kiss lasted only a moment before Elena pulled back, her cheeks flushed and her breathing unsteady. She looked into Thomas's eyes with an expression of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Thomas felt the same amazement. He'd kissed women before, but never had such a simple contact felt so significant, so full of promise and possibility. Elena's silence, which had once seemed like a barrier, now felt like a sacred space they shared. A quiet deeper than words were understanding bloomed without explanation. "I've never felt like this before," Thomas admitted. Elena wrote quickly. "Neither have I. I thought love required words, explanations, promises spoken aloud. But this feels like music without sound, like conversation without speech." Thomas read her words with growing emotion. "You're right. This is something entirely new." Elena wrote again. "Are you certain? A relationship with someone like any the town will talk. Your reputation could suffer." Thomas took the pencil from her hand and wrote his own response below hers. "Let them talk. You're worth any reputation I might lose. Besides, anyone who would judge you based on prejudice isn't someone whose opinion matters to me." Elena's eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. She threw her arms around Thomas's neck, holding him tightly as if she were afraid he might disappear. If she let go, Thomas held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. In that moment, surrounded by the tools and materials of their shared craft, he understood that they had created something more valuable than any memorial. They had forged a love strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the world might bring. When they finally separated, Elena picked up her pencil one more time. "The memorial isn't the only beautiful thing we're creating together." Thomas smiled, understanding that she was right. Their love was becoming a work of art as carefully crafted as any piece of metal they shaped, built through patience, understanding, and the recognition that true communication transcended the need for words. As the sun set over their workshop, casting long shadows across their nearly completed memorial, Thomas knew that his life had been permanently transformed. Elena hadn't just become his partner in work, she had become his partner in everything that mattered. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Abigail Thornton, Millbrook's self-appointed moral guardian, arrived at the forge unannounced. Thomas was in town collecting bronze for the memorial's final details, leaving Elena alone to work on the intricate engravings that would grace the memorial plaques. Mrs. Thornton stood in the doorway like a black-clad specter, her sharp eyes scanning the workshop with obvious disapproval. Elena, absorbed in her delicate work, didn't notice the visitor until a shadow fell across her workstation. Elena looked up to find Mrs. Thornton studying her with an expression of cold judgment. The older woman's gaze lingered on Elena's work. Clothes, her soot-stained hands, and the hammer she wielded with obvious skill. "So you're the girl," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The one who's been living in sin with Thomas Fletcher." Elena's face flushed, but she maintained her composure. She set down her tools and reached for the slate board. She kept nearby for communicating with visitors. "Don't bother with your little performances," Mrs. Thornton snapped. "I know exactly what you are. A woman of loose morals who uses her affliction to gain sympathy and exploit decent men." Elena stepped back instinctively, recognizing the particular brand of cruelty that came from women who viewed other women as competition or threats. She'd encountered this type before, women who blamed victims for men's choices, who saw vulnerability as manipulation rather than genuine need. Mrs. Thornton advanced into the workshop, her sharp heels clicking against the stone floor. "The entire town is talking about this scandalous arrangement. An unmarried man and woman living together, working together, behaving like husband and wife without the blessing of God or society." Elena reached for her journal, intending to write a response, but Mrs. Thornton snatched it away before she could begin. "More evidence of your deception," the older woman declared, flipping through pages of Elena's detailed notes and sketches. "All this writing, these drawings, you're far too educated to be the simple servant girl you pretend to be." What's your real story? What are you hiding? Elena's heart raced as Mrs. Thornton examined her most private thoughts and observations. The journal contained not just technical notes about metalwork, but personal reflections about her growing feelings for Thomas, detailed memories of her traumatic past, and hopes for their future together. Interesting, Mrs. Thornton murmured, pausing at a page where Elena had written about her first kiss with Thomas. Very interesting indeed. You've certainly managed to ensnare poor Thomas thoroughly, haven't you? Elena lunged for the journal, desperation overriding her usual caution. Mrs. Thornton jerked it away, her face triumphant in having provoked such a strong reaction. Protective of your secrets, aren't you? What would Thomas think if he knew you'd been documenting every intimate detail of your relationship? Planning your conquest like a military campaign? The accusation was so twisted, so far from the truth of Elena's genuine feelings, that tears sprang to her eyes. She shook her head frantically, trying to communicate that Mrs. Thornton was misunderstanding everything. Crocodile tears won't work on me, Mrs. Thornton said coldly. I've seen your type before. Women who use afflictions and sad stories to manipulate good men into providing for them. You've found quite a comfortable situation here, haven't you? Elena backed toward the forge, her hands shaking with emotion. She grabbed a piece of slate and began writing frantically. Not true. Love Thomas. Not using him. Mrs. Thornton read the words with a cruel smile. Love? Is that what you call this arrangement? A woman of virtue would insist on marriage before living in such intimacy. Your behavior proves exactly what kind of person you are. The workshop. Door burst open as Thomas returned from town, his arms full of supplies for the memorial's completion. He took in the scene immediately, Elena's distressed state, Mrs. Thornton's aggressive posture, and his beloved's journal clutched in the older woman's hands. Mrs. Thornton, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. What are you doing in my workshop? Discovering the truth about your little arrangement, Mrs. Thornton replied, unintimidated by Thomas's obvious anger. This girl has been documenting everything, Thomas. Every conversation, every intimate moment. She's using you. Thomas looked at Elena, who was now crying silently, her whole body shaking with emotion. He'd never seen her so distressed, so completely overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Give me the journal, Thomas said firmly. You should read it first, Mrs. Thornton insisted. See how she really thinks about you, about this relationship. See how she's been planning. Give me the journal now, Thomas repeated, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Reluctantly, Mrs. Thornton handed over Elena's private writings. Thomas took the leather-bound book and immediately returned it to Elena without reading a single page. Elena's private thoughts belong to her, Thomas said. Not to you, and not to me unless she chooses to share them. Mrs. Thornton's face reddened with indignation. Thomas Fletcher, this woman is making a fool of you. She's documented every detail of your relationship like she's studying you for some purpose. What decent woman behaves that way? Elena watched this exchange with growing despair, understanding that Mrs. Thornton's accusations were poisoning the air between her and Thomas. Even though he'd returned her journal unread, she could see questions beginning to form in his eyes. What purpose would that be, Mrs. Thornton? Thomas asked coldly. Financial gain, obviously. She's establishing a record that could be used to claim common law marriage rights, or to blackmail you if you try to end the arrangement. This girl is far more calculating than she appears. Thomas studied Elena's tear-stained face, seeing not calculation but genuine anguish. Elena, is there anything you want to tell me? Anything you've written that you're afraid I might misunderstand? Elena shook her head frantically, then opened her journal to a recent entry she'd written after their first kiss. With trembling hands, she showed Thomas the page. I never believed I could feel this way about someone. Thomas sees me as a complete person, not just a collection of limitations. When he kisses me, I feel like I'm finally home. I'm terrified that this happiness is too fragile to last, but I'm grateful for every moment we have together." Thomas read the words, his expression softening with each line. This wasn't the writing of someone planning manipulation. This was the honest expression of someone discovering love for the first time. "Mrs. Thornton," Thomas said without looking away from Elena, "your interpretation of Elena's character is not only wrong, it's cruel. She's done nothing but bring joy and meaning to my life." "Joy and meaning?" Mrs. Thornton's voice rose with outrage. "Thomas, you're living in sin. This arrangement is a scandal that reflects poorly on the entire community. The town council is already discussing intervention." "What kind of intervention?" Thomas asked, finally turning his attention back to the unwelcome visitor. "Mayor Walsh is considering whether your moral character makes you suitable for completing the memorial commission. The town fathers feel that a man who openly flaunts Christian values shouldn't be creating monuments to our honored dead." Elena gasped audibly, the first sound Thomas had ever heard her make. The threat to remove Thomas from the memorial project was devastating, not just professionally, but personally. The memorial had become their shared masterpiece, a testament to their creative partnership and growing love. "The memorial commission is based on my skills as a craftsman," Thomas said carefully, "not my personal relationships. In a town like Millbrook, Thomas, everything is connected. Your reputation affects your business, and your business affects your standing in the community. Unless you're willing to address this scandalous situation." Mrs. Thornton let the threat hang in the air, her meaning clear. Thomas would need to choose between Elena and his professional standing in Millbrook. Elena began writing frantically in her journal, then showed the page to Thomas. "I won't let my presence destroy your career. If leaving is what's best for you, I'll go." "No," Thomas said firmly, before Elena had even finished writing. "Absolutely not." Mrs. Thornton smiled with cruel satisfaction. "How touching. But romantic gestures won't change the practical realities, Thomas. This girl has no legal standing in your life, no protection if you decide you're tired of playing house, and no recourse when the town forces you to choose between her and your livelihood." Elena's face went pale as she understood the true precariousness of her situation. Despite the love growing between her and Thomas, she had no legal rights, no security beyond his continued affection. If the town pressured him enough, or if his feelings changed, she could be discarded as easily as she'd been purchased. "There is a solution," Mrs. Thornton continued, her voice deceptively helpful. "Marriage would legitimize the relationship and end the scandal. Of course, that would require Thomas to be certain of his feelings, and yours to be genuine rather than calculated." Elena looked at Thomas with an expression of hope mixed with terror. Marriage would indeed solve the immediate problem, but it would also test whether their relationship could survive external pressure and forced timelines. Thomas took Elena's hands in his, feeling their trembling, understanding the fear behind it. "Elena, you need to know that my feelings for you aren't dependent on what other people think or say. But you also need to know that Mrs. Thornton is right about one thing. This situation does put you in a vulnerable position." Elena wrote quickly, "I don't want you to marry me just to stop gossip or protect your business. That's not how love should work." "I agree," Thomas replied. "Love should be chosen freely, not forced by circumstances or other people's prejudices." Mrs. Thornton watched this exchange with growing frustration. "Thomas, be practical. This girl has no family, no resources, no alternative if you decide to end things. Marriage is the responsible choice. Marriage is a choice that Elena and I will make together, in our own time, for our own reasons," Thomas said firmly. "Not because you or the town council or anyone else thinks we should." Elena squeezed Thomas's hands, communicating her gratitude. for his refusal to be bullied into a premature decision. But she also understood that Mrs. Thornton's visit had changed everything. The sanctuary she'd found in Thomas's home and workshop was no longer secure. After Mrs. Thornton left with threats to return with the mayor and town council, Elena and Thomas stood together in the workshop that had become their shared creative space. The memorial, nearly complete and beautiful beyond anything either had imagined possible, seemed to mock them with its representation of sacrifice and honor. "What are we going to do?" Elena wrote. Thomas studied her question, understanding that it encompassed more than just the immediate crisis. They were being forced to define their relationship under pressure, to make decisions about their future, while defending their present. "We're going to finish the memorial," Thomas said finally. "We're going to create something so beautiful and meaningful that the town will have to acknowledge your contribution. And then we're going to decide what we want our future to look like, based on our feelings, not their prejudices." Elena nodded, finding strength in Thomas's determination. But privately, she wondered whether love could truly survive when the whole world seemed determined to destroy it. The journal that had once been her private sanctuary now felt like evidence that could be used against her, and the workshop that had become her haven suddenly felt exposed and dangerous. As they returned to work on the memorial's final details, both Elena and Thomas understood that they were racing against more than just the July 4th deadline. They were racing against the forces of judgment and prejudice that threatened to tear apart everything they'd built together. The memorial would soon be finished, but the real test of their relationship was just beginning. The emergency town council meeting was called for Friday evening, just 5 days before the memorial's scheduled unveiling. Thomas learned about it from Henry Caldwell, his longtime friend and the town's doctor, who arrived at the forge with worry etched deep in his weathered face. "Tom, you need to know what you're walking into," Dr. Caldwell said, accepting the cup of coffee Elena offered him with a grateful nod. "Mayor Walsh has convinced half the council that your situation makes you unfit to represent Millbrook's values through the memorial." Elena, who had been carefully applying patina to the memorial's bronze elements, set down her brush and moved closer to hear the conversation. Thomas noticed how she positioned herself where she could see both men's faces clearly, reading their expressions for nuances that words might not convey. "What exactly are they proposing?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. "They want to remove you from the project and bring in Crawford's crew from Pittsburgh to install a replacement memorial," Dr. Caldwell explained. "Something more conventional. They're calling it a matter of community standards." Elena's face went white. She grabbed her journal and wrote frantically, "They want to destroy our work, everything we've created together." Dr. Caldwell read her words with surprise. "Miss Hartwell, I've heard about your contributions to the memorial. From what people are saying, the craftsmanship is extraordinary." Elena looked up sharply, studying the doctor's face for signs of insincerity. She'd grown accustomed to Thomas's acceptance, but hearing respect from another townsperson was unexpected. "Elena has been essential to the project," Thomas said firmly. "Her artistic vision and technical skills have made the memorial something special, not just another civic decoration." "That's what I've heard," Dr. Caldwell continued. "Mrs. Patterson from the general store saw the work when she delivered supplies last week. She said it was the most moving piece of art she'd ever seen, that it actually made her cry thinking about her boy who died at Antietam." Elena blinked in surprise. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned nothing about being moved by the memorial during her delivery. She'd simply dropped off materials and left quickly, avoiding direct interaction with Elena. "People are talking, Tom," Dr. Caldwell said carefully. "Not all of it is negative. There's a growing group who believe the town should judge the memorial on its merit, not on gossip about your personal life." Thomas felt a flicker of hope. How large a group? Larger than Walsh realizes. Veterans' families, mostly. People who've lost someone and understand that honoring the dead is more important than judging the living. Dr. Caldwell paused. But they need to see the memorial before the council meeting. They need to understand what they'd be losing if Walsh gets his way. Elena began writing again. Could we arrange a private viewing? Let people see the memorial before the council decides. That's risky, Thomas said. If Walsh finds out, we're trying to influence opinion before the meeting. He's already trying to influence opinion, Dr. Caldwell pointed out. At least this way, people can make informed decisions based on seeing your actual work. Elena stood abruptly and walked to the covered memorial, which dominated one corner of the expanded workshop. She pulled away the protective cloth, revealing the nearly completed masterpiece for the first time in weeks. Dr. Caldwell gasped audibly. Even in the forge's dim lighting, the memorial was breathtaking. The spiral column seemed to twist upward with organic grace, carrying the souls of the fallen toward something beyond earthly suffering. The bronze eagle soared with wings spread in eternal protection, its feathers so realistic they seemed to move in the flickering light. But it was the central figure that truly captured attention. The young soldier removing his hat in farewell, his face turned toward home with an expression of profound humanity. Elena had somehow captured not just the physical reality of a man going to war, but the emotional weight of all such partings throughout history. Dear God, Dr. Caldwell whispered, this isn't just a memorial, it's poetry in metal. Elena flushed with pride and embarrassment at the doctor's reaction. She'd never heard her work described in such terms, never imagined that her contributions could move someone so deeply. Thomas felt his own pride swelling as he watched. Dr. Caldwell examined the memorial's details. Elena designed the central composition. He said, the spiral, the eagle's positioning, the soldier's expression, all of that came from her artistic vision. Remarkable, Dr. Caldwell murmured, studying the intricate engravings on the name plaques. Each fallen soldier's name was surrounded by subtle, decorative elements that reflected their individual stories, farming tools for those who'd worked, the land, books for the teacher who'd volunteered, musical notes for the church organist who'd never returned from Gettysburg. How did you know these details about each man? Dr. Caldwell asked Elena. Elena wrote, I talked to their families, their friends. I wanted each name to represent a real person, not just a casualty. Dr. Caldwell read her response with growing amazement. You interviewed the families when? How? Elena looked embarrassed as she wrote, I've been visiting them in the evenings after forge work. Most people are more willing to talk to someone who can't repeat their stories as gossip. They told me about their sons, husbands, brothers. I wanted the memorial to honor who they really were. Thomas stared at Elena in astonishment. He'd known she often went out in the evenings, but he'd assumed she was simply walking for exercise or enjoying solitude. The idea that she'd been systematically visiting grieving families, collecting stories and memories to incorporate into the memorial, revealed a depth of dedication he hadn't imagined. Elena, why didn't you tell me you were doing this? Thomas asked. She wrote, I wanted it to be a surprise. I thought if the memorial could tell their real stories, people would understand that this is about more than just craft or artistry. It's about remembering. Dr. Caldwell was still examining the memorial's details, discovering new elements with each closer look. Miss Hartwell, this level of personal research and artistic integration is extraordinary. You've created something that will help people process grief, not just acknowledge loss. Elena ducked her head, overwhelmed by the praise. She'd never thought of her work in such terms, but Dr. Caldwell's words helped her understand why the project had felt so important, so necessary to complete properly. We need to arrange that viewing, Thomas said decisively. People need to see this before the council meeting. Dr. Caldwell nodded. I'll speak to Mrs. Patterson, the Hendersons, the Morley family. people who lost someone and have influence in the community. Can you have the memorial ready for viewing by Sunday afternoon? The final details will be complete by then, Thomas. Confirmed. But Dr. Caldwell, what about the charges against our living arrangement? How do we address that? Dr. Caldwell glanced at Elena, then back to Thomas. That's more complicated. Mrs. Thornton has been very effective at framing this as a moral issue rather than a personal choice. Elena wrote quickly, "What if we were married before the council meeting? Would that end the objections?" Thomas felt his heart skip at Elena's direct approach to the marriage question. They'd been avoiding the topic since Mrs. Thornton's visit, both understanding that external pressure was the wrong reason to make such a decision. "Elena," Thomas said carefully, "marriage shouldn't be a strategy to win a town council vote." She wrote, "But what if it's something we both want anyway?" "What? If the pressure just makes us face what we've been avoiding discussing?" Dr. Caldwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should leave you two to discuss this privately?" "No, stay," Thomas said. "Dr. Caldwell, as a friend, what's your honest opinion about our situation?" The older man considered carefully before answering. "Tom, I've known you for 15 years. I've never seen you happier or more creative than you've been these past months. Miss Hartwell clearly cares for you deeply, and her contributions to this community, through the memorial and through her positive influence on you, have been remarkable." Elena listened intently, searching Dr. Caldwell's face for sincerity. "But," the doctor continued, "I also understand the practical realities. Miss Hartwell has no legal protection in this arrangement. If something happened to you, Tom, she'd have no claim to property, no security, no standing in the community. From a practical standpoint, marriage would protect you both." Elena wrote, "But would marriage under pressure be fair to Thomas? What if he's not ready, or what if he comes to resent being forced into it?" Thomas read her question with growing emotion. Even facing potential loss of everything they'd built together, Elena was more concerned about his feelings than her own security. "Elena," Thomas said softly, "can I tell you something I've been thinking about for weeks?" She nodded, her gray eyes fixed on his face. "I wake up every morning grateful that you're here. I fall asleep every night hoping you'll still be here tomorrow. When I imagine my future, you're in every scene I can picture." Thomas paused, gathering courage. "The only thing that's kept me from proposing already is fear that you might think I'm asking out of obligation rather than love." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she absorbed his words. She wrote with shaking hands, "I've been afraid of the same thing, that if I told you how much I want to marry you, you'd think I was just seeking security rather than offering my whole heart." Dr. Caldwell smiled at this exchange. "It seems to me that you're both overthinking this. You love each other, you want to build a life together, and marriage would solve several practical problems while formalizing feelings you already have. What exactly are you waiting for?" Elena laughed silently, her whole body shaking with mirth at the doctor's practical approach to their romantic dilemma. Thomas found himself laughing too, realizing how unnecessarily complicated they'd made something that was actually quite simple. "Elena Hartwell," Thomas said formally, taking her hands in his, "will you marry me because I love you more than I ever thought possible, and because I want to spend every remaining day of my life creating beautiful things with you?" Elena nodded enthusiastically before picking up her pencil to write. "Yes, Thomas Fletcher, I will marry you because you see my heart instead of my limitations, and because loving you has taught me what it means to be truly alive." Dr. Caldwell beamed at them both. "Excellent. I happen to know Judge Morrison quite well. He could perform the ceremony as early as tomorrow if you're willing to have a simple service." Elena wrote, "Could we have the ceremony here, in the workshop where we found each other? With the memorial as witness to our promises." Thomas felt his heart swell at the poetry of Elena's suggestion. "Perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect." As They began planning their impromptu wedding. Thomas realized that Mrs. Thornton's attack had actually forced them to confront feelings they'd been dancing around for weeks. What had started as a crisis was becoming the catalyst for the next chapter of their story together. The memorial would be completed. The town council would make their decision, and whatever happened, Thomas and Elena would face it as husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, but inside the workshop, surrounded by the fruits of their collaborative artistry, Thomas and Elena were creating something even more beautiful than the memorial, a marriage built on mutual respect, shared creativity, and love that needed no words to be understood. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself reflected the tension building toward evening's town council meeting. Elena woke before sunrise, her mind immediately jumping to the dual significance of the day, her wedding to Thomas in the afternoon, followed by the council's decision that could destroy everything they'd worked to build. She found Thomas already awake in the kitchen, staring out the window at their garden where raindrops bent the flower stems under their weight. Without his usual morning greeting, Elena could sense the anxiety he was trying to hide. Elena wrote in her journal and showed him, having second thoughts about marrying someone who might lose his livelihood tonight. Thomas turned and pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "Never," he said firmly. "If we lose the memorial commission, we'll find another way. If we have to leave Millbrook, we'll build something new somewhere else. But losing you? That's not a possibility I'm willing to consider." Elena relaxed against him, drawing strength from his certainty. She'd spent much of the night worrying that he might wake up regretting their impulsive engagement, seeing it as a rash decision made under pressure. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the kitchen window, they could see a small crowd gathering near the workshop. Despite the early hour and persistent drizzle, Thomas and Elena exchanged glances before hurrying outside to investigate. They found Dr. Caldwell standing with Mrs. Patterson from the general store, old Mr. Henderson, whose son had died at Bull Run, and Sarah Morley, who'd lost her husband in the final weeks of the war. "Tom, Elena," Dr. Caldwell called out as they approached. "These folks wanted to see the memorial before the council meeting tonight. Word has been spreading about what you've created." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her usually stern demeanor softened by obvious emotion. "Miss Hartwell, Dr. Caldwell told us about the personal details you included for each of our boys. I'd like to see what you've done for my Samuel." Elena nodded and gestured toward the workshop, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. This would be the first time any of the bereaved families saw how she'd honored their loved ones. Memories dot inside the workshop. The memorial stood completed except for final polishing. Even in the gray morning light filtering through windows, the bronze and iron composition commanded attention. But Elena watched the visitors' faces rather than the memorial itself, searching for their reactions to seeing their private grief transformed into public. Mrs. Patterson approached Samuel's name plaque slowly, her fingers tracing the letters Elena had engraved with such care. Around his name, Elena had incorporated tiny musical notes, a detail based on Mrs. Patterson's stories about Samuel's love for playing fiddle at barn dances. "You remembered," Mrs. Patterson whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You remembered that he loved music." Elena wrote quickly, "You said he played Sweet Betsy from Pike the night before he left for war. I wanted people to know he was more than just a soldier." Mrs. Patterson read Elena's note through blurry eyes, then surprised everyone by pulling Elena into a fierce embrace. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for making him real again." Sarah Morley had found her husband's section, where Elena had incorporated symbols representing his work as a carpenter. Tiny hammer and saw motifs worked into the decorative border. "He built our house with these same tools," Sarah said wonderingly. "How did you know to include them?" Elena wrote, You told me he carved your wedding ring from a piece of oak on your first anniversary. I thought his hands that created so much beauty deserved to be remembered." Mr. Henderson stood before his son's memorial for a long time without speaking. Elena had included farming symbols around young Henderson's name, wheat stalks and plowshares that reflected his love for the land. When the old man finally turned around, his weathered face was wet with tears. 60 years I've lived in this town," he said hoarsely. "I've seen plenty of monuments and memorials, but this actually brings my boy back to me. I can see him in these symbols, remember who he was instead of just how he died." Elena felt overwhelmed by the family's reactions. She'd hoped her personal research would add meaning to the memorial, but she hadn't anticipated how powerfully these small details would affect those who'd lost so much. More families began arriving. Throughout the morning, word having spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community that the memorial was available for viewing. Each family found their loved one represented not just by name, but by symbols that captured their individuality and humanity. The Brennan family discovered that their son, Michael's section included book symbols, honoring his dream of becoming a teacher. The Walsh family, no relation to the mayor, found musical instruments around their boy's name, reflecting his service as the regiment's drummer boy. Even families whose members Elena hadn't specifically interviewed found personal meaning in the memorial's overall composition. By noon, nearly 30 people had gathered in and around the workshop. The crowd included not just bereaved families, but other townspeople drawn by curiosity and word-of-mouth reports about the memorial's exceptional quality. Thomas watched this spontaneous gathering with growing amazement. Elena's systematic approach to honoring each individual had created something unprecedented, a memorial that functioned as both public art and personal shrine, allowing private grief to find expression in shared community mourning. "Elena," Thomas said during a brief lull in visitors, "do you realize what you've accomplished here? You've created something that helps people heal." Elena blushed and wrote, "I just wanted to make sure they weren't forgotten as individuals. But seeing how their families respond, it means more than I ever imagined." Dr. Caldwell approached them with news that would affect the evening's council meeting. "Tom, Elena, I've been talking to people all morning. The response to the memorial is unanimous. Everyone who's seen it believes the town would be making a terrible mistake to replace it with something conventional." "Will that be enough to sway the council?" Thomas asked. "It should be," Dr. Caldwell replied. "But Mayor Walsh has been busy too. He's bringing in Reverend Blackwood from the county seat to speak about moral standards and community values. Walsh is framing this as a choice between artistic merit and moral character." Elena's face fell as she understood the implication. No matter how beautiful or meaningful the memorial might be, some people would always prioritize moral judgments over artistic achievement. Thomas took Elena's hand, squeezing gently. "Dr. Caldwell, what time is Judge Morrison arriving for the wedding ceremony?" 2 o'clock. "He's bringing the necessary paperwork and his wife is a witness." Dr. Caldwell smiled. "Quite a day you've chosen, getting married and facing the town council within hours of each other." Elena wrote, "Better to face whatever comes as husband and wife than to face it separately." At exactly 2 o'clock, Judge Morrison arrived with his wife Margaret, a cheerful woman who immediately embraced the romance of the unconventional wedding setting. The judge was a practical man in his 60s who'd performed hundreds of ceremonies, but even he seemed moved by the idea of a wedding taking place in the workshop, where the couple had found love through shared creativity. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Fletcher," Judge Morrison began formally, "marriage is a legal contract, but it's also a spiritual and emotional commitment. Are you both certain this is what you want, regardless of external pressures or circumstances?" Elena and Thomas looked at each other, communicating volumes in a single glance. Elena wrote her response and showed it to the judge. I want to marry Thomas because he sees my soul instead of my limitations, and because creating beautiful things together has taught us that love multiplies when it's shared. Thomas spoke his own heart. I want to marry Elena because she's taught me that the most important conversations happen without words, and because loving her has made me understand what it means to be truly understood. Judge Morrison smiled at their responses. Then let's begin. The ceremony itself was simple but profoundly moving. Surrounded by the tools of their trade and the memorial that represented their collaborative artistry, Elena and Thomas exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Elena's vows were read aloud by Mrs. Morrison from her journal, while Thomas spoke his promises directly. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Elena with gentle reverence, understanding that this moment marked not just their legal union but the beginning of a partnership that would endure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the small group of witnesses, Dr. Caldwell, the Morrisons, and several family members who'd stayed after viewing the memorial, applauded with genuine enthusiasm. Elena had never imagined her wedding would take place in a blacksmith's workshop with soot-stained walls and the smell of coal smoke in the air, but she couldn't conceive of anywhere more perfect. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, more townspeople arrived to view the memorial before the council meeting. Word had spread about the wedding as well, and Elena found herself receiving congratulations from people who'd barely acknowledged her existence. Just weeks before, Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by announcing that she'd organized the wives of fallen soldiers to attend the council meeting as a group. If Mayor Walsh wants to make this about moral character, she declared, he'll have to explain to war widows why their husband's memorial should be destroyed because of gossip and prejudice. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward the older woman, who'd become an unexpected ally. She wrote, "Thank you for standing with us when you could have stayed neutral." Mrs. Patterson read the note and smiled. "Child, when someone honors my son's memory the way you have, there's no such thing as staying neutral. You've given us back pieces of our boys we thought were lost forever." As 6 o'clock approached, Thomas and Elena prepared to walk to the town hall for the council meeting that would determine their future in Millbrook. Elena wore her best dress, the one she'd been married in just hours before, while Thomas donned his formal suit, the same one he'd worn to receive the memorial commission 6 weeks earlier. Standing together in their workshop, looking at the memorial that had brought them together and might now tear them apart, Elena felt a mixture of fear and determination. Whatever the council decided, she and Thomas would face it together, as husband and wife, partners in art and life. Thomas took her hand as they prepared to leave. "Ready, Mrs. Fletcher?" Elena smiled at hearing her new name, then wrote one final note before they departed: "Ready for anything, as long as we face it together." The rain had stopped, and evening sunlight was breaking through the clouds as they walked toward the town hall, where their future would be decided by people who had never understood what they'd built together, but who might finally be forced to recognize its value. The Millbrook Town Hall had never hosted such a charged atmosphere. By 7 o'clock, every seat was filled, with additional townspeople standing along the walls and crowding near the doorways. Elena and Thomas sat in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together as they faced the 5-member town council. Arrayed behind an imposing oak table, Mayor Walsh sat at the center, flanked by the other council members whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to openly hostile. Behind the council table stood Reverend Blackwood, a stern man in his 50s whose reputation for moral inflexibility had preceded him from the county seat. Elena studied the crowd, noting familiar faces among those who'd viewed the memorial. Throughout the day, Mrs. Patterson sat directly behind them with a group of war widows, their black dresses a somber reminder of why the memorial existed in the first place. Dr. Caldwell occupied a seat near the middle, nodding encouragingly when Elena caught his eye. But Elena also noticed less friendly faces, Mrs. Tharton and her allies, positioned strategically throughout the room to make their disapproval visible. The division in the community was literally mapped across the seating arrangement. Supporters and detractors separated by invisible lines of moral and artistic judgment. Mayor Walsh called the meeting to order with unnecessary force, his gavel echoing through the tense silence. This emergency session has been called to address concerns about the memorial project and the character of those representing our community through their work. Elena felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers as Walsh's opening words immediately framed the discussion in moral rather than artistic terms. Before we proceed, Walsh continued, I want to introduce Reverend Blackwood, who has graciously agreed to provide guidance on the moral implications of our decision tonight. Reverend Blackwood rose with theatrical solemnity, his piercing gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd before settling on Elena and Thomas. Citizens of Millbrook, he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed hall. We gather tonight to consider not just artistic merit, but the moral foundation upon which your community stands. Elena forced herself to maintain steady eye contact with the Reverend, refusing to be intimidated by his condemning stare. She'd faced worse judgment in her past and survived. She could certainly endure whatever moral lectures he intended to deliver. The question before us, Reverend Blackwood continued, is whether a community should honor its sacred dead through the work of those who openly flout the moral standards that these very soldiers died to defend. A murmur ran through the crowd, some nodding agreement while others shifted uncomfortably at the Reverend's harsh tone. Elena noticed that several of the war widows exchanged glances, their expressions suggesting they found the Reverend's approach distasteful. Furthermore, the Reverend pressed on, we must consider what message we send to our young people when we reward immoral behavior with prestigious commissions and community recognition. Thomas started to rise, his face flushed with anger at the personal attack, but Elena placed a restraining hand on his arm. She'd learned long ago that responding to such accusations with emotion only validated the accuser's premise that she and Thomas had something to be ashamed of. Mayor Walsh reclaimed control of the meeting. Thank you, Reverend Blackwood. Now, we'll hear from community members who wish to speak for or against continuing with the current memorial project. Mrs. Thornton was the first to stand, her black dress and severe expression making her look like a harbinger of judgment. Mayor Walsh, members of the council, I speak for the moral women of this community when I say that we cannot allow our sacred memorial to be tainted by scandal. Elena watched Mrs. Thornton's performance with clinical detachment, noting how the woman positioned herself as the voice of community virtue while simultaneously destroying the community's most meaningful artistic achievement. The living arrangement between Mr. Fletcher and this person has been the subject of gossip and speculation for weeks. Mrs. Thornton continued, her pause before person clearly intended to emphasize Elena's lesser status. Can we truly honor our dead through the work of those who live in open sin? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from anger at Mrs. Thornton's deliberate cruelty. The woman was using the memorial, a project intended to honor fallen soldiers, as a weapon in her personal campaign of moral superiority. Thomas squeezed Elena's hand, communicating his own frustration with the direction of the discussion. They'd expected criticism of their relationship, but the casual dismissal of Elena's artistic contributions felt particularly insulting. Dr. Caldwell rose to speak next, his medical authority lending weight to his words. Mayor Walsh, I've known Thomas Fletcher for 15 years. His character and integrity have never been questioned before this manufactured controversy. Elena noticed how Dr. Caldwell's choice of words, manufactured controversy, subtly challenged the legitimacy of the entire proceeding. More importantly, Dr. Caldwell continued, I've had the privilege of viewing the completed memorial. The artistic achievement is extraordinary, but what makes it truly special is how it honors each individual soldier rather than treating them as anonymous casualties. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward Dr. Caldwell for focusing on the memorial's artistic merit rather than engaging with the moral accusations. Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Fletcher, I should say, as they were married this afternoon, personally researched each fallen soldier's life and interests. She incorporated details that transformed the memorial from generic civic decoration into genuine tribute to real people. The revelation of their marriage sent shocked murmurs through the crowd. Elena noticed some faces brighten with approval while others darkened with further disapproval. Mrs. Thornton looked particularly annoyed that her moral ammunition had been partially diffused. Old Mr. Henderson struggled to his feet, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick for support. "I'm 83 years old," he began, his voice shaky but determined. "I've buried my parents, my wife, and my only son. I've seen plenty of memorials in my time." Elena watched the old man with growing emotion, remembering his tears when he'd first seen his son's section of the memorial that morning. "What Mrs. Fletcher created for my boy isn't just art," Henderson continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's love made visible. She took the time to learn who these boys really were, not just how they died. That's not scandal, that's sacred work." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at Henderson's characterization of her research as sacred work. She'd never thought of her interviews with families in such terms, but she understood what he meant. The act of preserving individual memories against the anonymity of collective grief was indeed sacred. Sarah Morley stood next, her young widows. Weeds a stark reminder of war's personal cost. "My husband built this town's church with his own hands," she said clearly. "He believed that the most important work was done with love and attention to detail. Mrs. Fletcher honored his memory with that same careful attention." Elena noticed how each speaker was focusing on her personal contributions to the memorial rather than defending her moral character. It was a strategic choice that elevated the discussion above gossip and moral judgment. Mrs. Patterson rose with the dignity of someone accustomed to community leadership. "I've lived in Millbrook for 40 years. I've seen this town judge people for being different, for being struggling, for being wounded by life's circumstances." Elena held her breath, wondering which direction Mrs. Patterson's comments would take. "What I saw in my son's memorial today wasn't the work of someone living in sin," Mrs. Patterson continued firmly. "It was the work of someone who understands loss and refuses to let good people be forgotten." Elena felt overwhelming gratitude toward the woman who'd become her unexpected champion. Mrs. Patterson's moral authority in the community was unquestionable, making her support particularly valuable. "Furthermore," Mrs. Patterson added with steel in her voice, "I find it shameful that we're questioning the morality of a woman who's done more to honor our dead than anyone else in this town." Several of the war widows murmured agreement, their collective presence adding weight to Mrs. Patterson's words. Elena realized that these women, who'd paid the ultimate price for others' freedom, commanded moral authority that even Reverend Blackwood couldn't challenge directly. Councilman Bradley, who'd remained silent throughout the testimonials, finally spoke. "Mrs. Fletcher, you've heard various opinions about your character and your work. Would you like to respond to the charges that have been made?" Elena felt every eye in the room focus on her as she stood slowly. She'd known this moment would come, when she'd be forced to defend not just her work, but her very right to exist in this community. She pulled out her journal and began writing, her hand steady despite the charged atmosphere. When she finished, she handed the pages to Thomas, who would read her words aloud. Thomas stood beside her, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall as he read Elena's carefully chosen words. "I cannot speak in my own defense, but I can. Let my work speak for me. When I came to Millbrook, I was someone society had discarded as worthless. Thomas Fletcher saw value where others saw only limitation." Elena watched faces in the crowd as Thomas continued reading her words, noting which People seemed moved and which remained unmoved by her appeal. Together, we created something that honors the memory of your sons, husbands, and brothers. We researched their lives, learned their stories, and incorporated their individual humanity into lasting tribute. This wasn't just craft work, it was an act of love for people I never met, but came to know through their families' memories. Elena noticed Reverend Blackwood's stern expression beginning to waver as Thomas read her description of the personal research and family interviews. You can judge my moral character however you choose. Thomas continued reading, but please don't let that judgment destroy something that brings comfort to those who've lost the most. The memorial belongs to the families of the fallen, not to those who would use it as a weapon in moral warfare. Elena's final words hung in the air as Thomas finished reading. The hall fell completely silent as people absorbed her direct challenge to the council's priorities. Mayor Walsh looked around the room, clearly sensing that public opinion was shifting in directions he hadn't anticipated. The moral outrage he'd hoped to generate was being overwhelmed by artistic appreciation and sympathy for the bereaved families. The council will now deliberate, Walsh announced reluctantly. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes with our decision. As the council filed out for private discussion, Elena remained standing, surrounded by the buzz of conversation from townspeople, processing what they'd heard. She felt Thomas's arm around her waist, providing steady support. As they waited to learn whether their life's work would be accepted or destroyed, the next 30 minutes would determine not just the fate of the memorial, but whether Millbrook was the kind of community that valued art and compassion over judgment and moral posturing. The 30 minutes of council deliberation stretched like hours. Elena and Thomas remained in their seats while the crowd milled around them, some offering words of support, others maintaining careful distance. Elena found herself studying the faces of people she'd lived among for months, reading their expressions for clues about how they truly viewed her and Thomas. Mrs. Patterson approached during the wait, her weathered hands clasping Elena's with surprising warmth. Child, regardless of what those men decide tonight, you've already won something more important than their approval. Elena looked at her questioningly, and Mrs. Patterson continued. You've shown this town what love actually looks like, not the pretty words people say in church, but the kind that rolls up its sleeves and does sacred work for strangers. Elena felt tears threaten at Mrs. Patterson's words, but before she could respond, the council members began filing back into the hall. Mayor Walsh's expression was unreadable, while the other council members showed varying degrees of discomfort. With whatever decision they'd reached, the crowd quickly settled as Walsh called for order. Elena gripped Thomas's hand so tightly she worried she might hurt him, but he squeezed back with equal intensity, both drawing strength from their connection. After considerable deliberation, Walsh began, his voice lacking its usual authority. The council has reached a decision regarding the memorial project. Elena's heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone in the hall could hear it. Beside her, Thomas sat with rigid posture, his jaw clenched as they waited for words that would either validate or destroy months of collaborative work. By a vote of 3-2, Walsh continued reluctantly, the council has decided to proceed with the current memorial, to be unveiled as scheduled during tomorrow's 4th of July celebration. Elena felt the words hit her like a physical blow of relief. Around them, the hall erupted in a mixture of applause and disappointed grumbling, but Elena heard only the roaring of blood in her ears as the magnitude of their victory settled over her. Thomas turned to her with an expression of stunned joy, pulling her into his arms as Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Caldwell cheered behind them. Elena buried her face against Thomas's shoulder, overwhelmed by emotions too complex for even her extensive vocabulary to capture. However, Walsh continued, his voice cutting through the celebration, the council wishes to make clear that this decision is based solely on the artistic merit of the memorial and the expressed wishes of the bereaved families. It should not be interpreted as endorsement of unconventional living arrangements. Elena pulled back from Thomas's embrace, understanding that Walsh was trying to save face while delivering a defeat he clearly hadn't expected. The mayor's careful wording attempted to separate approval of their work from approval of their relationship, but Elena found she didn't care about such political maneuvering. Councilman Bradley, who Elena had noticed seemed sympathetic throughout the proceedings, rose to add his own comments. "I want to state for the record that Mrs. Fletcher's research and artistic vision transformed what could have been a generic monument into something that will genuinely help our community process grief and remember our fallen heroes appropriately." Elena felt gratitude toward Bradley for using her married name and acknowledging her individual contributions, rather than treating her as merely Thomas's assistant. As the formal meeting concluded, and people began filing out of the hall, Elena found herself surrounded by families whose loved ones were honored in the memorial. Each person seemed to want to express personal gratitude for the care she'd taken in preserving individual memories. "Mrs. Fletcher," said young Mary Walsh, the mayor's own niece, whose brother had died at Chancellorsville, "what you included about Jimmy's love for astronomy, the star patterns around his name, it meant everything to our family. He used to say the stars were letters from God, and somehow you captured that." Elena's eyes widened as she realized she'd never specifically researched Jimmy Walsh's interests. She wrote quickly, "I don't remember interviewing your family about astronomy. Where did that detail come from?" Mary looked confused. "You didn't interview us directly, but you must have talked to Mrs. Henderson next door. Jimmy spent hours on her porch looking through her late husband's telescope." Elena felt a chill of recognition. She had indeed spoken with Mrs. Henderson about her husband's interests, and the old woman had mentioned a young neighbor boy who loved stargazing. Elena had included astronomical symbols in that section without consciously connecting them to Jimmy Walsh. Thomas noticed Elena's expression. "What is it?" Elena wrote, "I think I included details for people I didn't even know I was honoring. The research connected in ways I didn't plan." Dr. Caldwell, overhearing this exchange, smiled with understanding. "Elena, when you opened your heart to truly learning about these families, you absorbed more than conscious facts. You absorbed the community's interconnected stories." Elena pondered this as more families shared similar discoveries, details they found meaningful that Elena didn't remember specifically researching, but which had emerged from the web of relationships and stories she'd carefully documented. As the crowd thinned, Reverend Blackwood approached Elena and Thomas with an expression that was difficult to read. Elena braced herself for a final moral lecture, but the Reverend's words surprised her. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said quietly, "I came here tonight prepared to condemn what I saw as moral failure. But listening to these families describe your work, I'm forced to reconsider my judgment." Elena studied his face, searching for sincerity behind the formal words. "The sacred work you've done, honoring the dead and comforting the living. Perhaps I was wrong to focus on convention rather than compassion." Reverend Blackwood paused, clearly struggling with admitting error. "Your memorial is a form of ministry I hadn't recognized." Elena felt shocked by this unexpected acknowledgement from their harshest critic. She wrote, "Thank you for being willing to see beyond first impressions." The Reverend read her note and nodded gravely. "Perhaps we all need practice at seeing beyond first impressions, Mrs. Fletcher." After Reverend Blackwood departed, Elena and Thomas found themselves alone with Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Caldwell in the emptying hall. The victory felt surreal after months of building toward this moment. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked, voicing the question Elena hadn't dared consider during their focus on simply surviving the council meeting. Dr. Caldwell smiled. "Now you can do consider during their focus on simply surviving the council meeting." Dr. Caldwell smiled. "Now you can do it consider during this passing you current their focus on simply surviving the council meeting. Unveil the memorial tomorrow and begin living as the respected community members you've proven yourselves to be." Mrs. Patterson nodded agreement. "The memorial will bring visitors from other towns, other counties. People will come to see what all the excitement was about. Your reputation will extend far beyond Millbrook." Elena felt both excited and terrified by this prospect. The attention could bring new opportunities, but it could also bring new scrutiny and challenges. "Are you ready for that kind of recognition?" Thomas asked, understanding Elena's mixed feelings about public attention. Elena considered carefully before writing, "I'm ready for whatever comes, as long as we face it together." Tonight proved that love and truth can survive judgment and prejudice. The 4th of July dawning broke clear and bright, perfect weather for the memorial's public unveiling. Elena woke early to find Thomas already dressed in his finest clothes, his hair carefully combed and his expression mixing pride with nervousness. "Big day, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, using her new name with obvious pleasure. Elena smiled and wrote, "The biggest day of our lives so far, but not the last one." They walked to the town square together, where a platform had been erected beside the memorial's designated location. Elena was amazed to see crowds already gathering, with people arriving from neighboring towns who'd heard about the controversial masterpiece. Mayor Walsh, looking decidedly uncomfortable but resigned to his civic duties, approached them as they surveyed the scene. "Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, the memorial will be unveiled at 2 o'clock. We're expecting significant attendance." Elena noticed how Walsh now addressed them both respectfully, his political instincts adapting to the previous night's community response. The morning passed quickly as Elena and Thomas made final preparations, carefully positioning the memorial and ensuring every detail was perfect for its public debut. Elena found herself thinking about all the people whose stories were embedded in the metalwork, the families who'd trusted her with their most precious memories. At precisely 2 o'clock, Mayor Walsh stepped onto the platform and called for attention from the assembled crowd. Elena estimated nearly 300 people had gathered, far more than Millbrook's population, confirming that word of the memorial had spread throughout the region. "Citizens and visitors," Walsh began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "today we dedicate this memorial to the brave men of Millbrook who gave their lives in service to our nation." Elena felt Thomas take her hand as Walsh continued with conventional dedication remarks. But she found her attention focused on the faces in the crowd, some familiar, many unknown, all waiting to see what she and Thomas had created together. "The memorial you're about to see represents not just artistic achievement, but a new understanding of how we honor those we've lost," Walsh continued, clearly reading from prepared remarks that someone else had written. "Created through the collaborative efforts of Mr. Thomas Fletcher and Mrs. Elena Fletcher, this monument captures both the collective sacrifice and individual humanity of our fallen heroes." Elena noticed how Walsh emphasized their married status and collaborative partnership, politically protecting himself while acknowledging their joint achievement. "It is my honor to unveil Millbrook's memorial to our honored dead," Walsh concluded, pulling the cord that released the covering cloth. The memorial stood revealed in full afternoon sunlight, its bronze and iron surfaces gleaming with life and movement. Elena heard gasps from the crowd as people absorbed the artistic complexity and emotional power of what she and Thomas had created. The spiral column seemed to lift the souls of the fallen toward heaven itself, while the protective eagle spread wings that appeared to shelter the entire community. But it was the central figure, the young soldier bidding farewell, that captured hearts and minds, his humanity so vividly rendered that viewers felt they were witnessing an actual moment of departure. Elena watched faces in the crowd transform as people discovered the personal details embedded throughout the memorial. Family members found their loved ones' symbols, while strangers learned about individuals they'd never known, but now would never forget. "My God," whispered someone near them, "it's not just a memorial. It's a story told in metal. Elena felt Thomas squeeze her hand as they witnessed the crowd's response to their shared vision. People weren't just admiring the craftsmanship. They were connecting emotionally with the stories Elena had preserved through her careful research. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside them, with tears streaming down her face. Elena, Thomas, you've given us something we didn't even know we needed. This isn't just remembrance, it's healing. As the afternoon progressed, Elena found herself in conversation. After conversation with visitors who wanted to understand her research process and artistic vision. Using written notes in Thomas's voice, she explained how love and attention to detail had guided every decision. "Mrs. Fletcher," said a woman from the neighboring county, "we have a memorial project beginning next month. Would you consider consulting on the design?" Elena looked at Thomas with excitement and surprise. She wrote, "Are you asking me to design memorials for other communities?" "We're asking you to help us honor our dead the way you've honored yours," the woman replied, "with love instead of just duty." More requests followed throughout the day. Towns wanting Elena's consultation, artists wanting to learn her techniques, families seeking help with private memorials. Elena realized that their struggle in Millbrook had launched something larger than they'd ever imagined. As evening approached and the crowds began dispersing, Elena and Thomas stood together before their completed memorial, watching the last light of day illuminate the bronze eagle's wings. Elena thought about the desperate woman who'd arrived in Millbrook just months before, believing herself worthless and unwanted. "Do you remember what you wrote in your journal that first week?" Thomas asked, somehow reading her thoughts. "About hoping to find a place where you belonged?" Elena nodded, remembering her early fears and uncertainties. "I think you found something better than belonging," Thomas continued. "You found a way to help others belong, to their memories, to their community, to something larger than their individual grief." Elena wrote her response carefully. "We found it together. Love taught us that the most beautiful things are created when two people see the world through each other's eyes." Thomas read her words and pulled her close, both of them silhouetted against their creation as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Elena felt the iron flower Thomas had made for her on their first day together, still carried in her pocket after all these months, and understood that their story was just beginning. The girl who couldn't speak and the man who chose silence had found their voices together, creating beauty that would outlast them both and bring comfort to people they would never meet. In a world that often valued noise over meaning, they had proven that love's truest language needed no words at all. As they walked home together through Millbrook's quiet streets, Elena reflected on the miracle of their journey. Two wounded souls had found each other across the silence, forged a love strong enough to survive judgment and prejudice, and created something beautiful enough to heal an entire community's grief. Their love story would be told for generations, not as a tale of overcoming disability or defying convention, but as proof that when two hearts truly understand each other, they can create wonders that speak to every soul brave enough to listen with love instead of judgment. Elena Fletcher had finally found her voice, and it rang clearer than any sound. In the harmony she'd built with Thomas, a marriage of hearts, hands, and vision that would endure as long as metal could hold its shape and love could find expression in the patient work of understanding souls. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.